In the middle of pregnancy, she received divorce papers. Her response made him beg in court. Grace sat on the edge of her bed, staring down at the small white stick in her trembling hand. The two pink lines were undeniable. A swirl of emotions washed over her: relief, joy, disbelief, and most of all, hope. For years, she and Brandon had tried. The late-night tears, the quiet frustrations, and the appointments that ended with more questions than answers, they were all behind her now. She had taken the test alone, not because Brandon wasn't home, but because something in her gut told her this was a moment she needed to experience first, uninterrupted. A smile formed on her lips as she imagined telling him. This baby would bring them closer. She was sure of it. Brandon had seemed distant lately, but Grace had attributed that to work stress. His firm had been taking on difficult clients, and he often came home late, exhausted and quiet. But tonight would be different. She would cook his favorite meal, wear the red dress he once said made her glow, and tell him about the miracle growing inside her. Maybe, just maybe, it would ignite the spark that had faded. She folded the test carefully into tissue and tucked it away in her drawer. As she glanced at herself in the mirror, she whispered, "You're going to be a mom." For the first time in weeks, her heart felt full. That evening, Grace lit candles and plated Brandon's meal just as she used to in their early years. The red wine sat unopened on the table. She had poured sparkling water for herself, a subtle nod to the change growing within her. When Brandon walked through the door, she rushed to greet him with a hug, but he stepped aside to remove his shoes, barely meeting her gaze. "Smells good," he muttered. She forced a smile, brushing off the coldness. They sat, and for most of the meal, he scrolled through his phone, nodding occasionally as she tried to make light conversation about neighbors and the weather. It wasn't until dessert that she finally said, "I have something to tell you." She reached into her pocket and placed the test beside his plate. Brandon stared at it for a moment before slowly setting down his fork. Grace waited, her eyes hopeful, but his reaction was nothing like she imagined. "Seriously?" he said flatly. "Now?" His voice was low, but sharp. "You picked now, of all times?" Grace blinked, taken aback. "I thought you'd be happy." Brandon laughed bitterly, pushing his plate away. "Grace, we can barely talk without arguing. You thought a baby would fix that?" Her lips parted, but no words came. The candlelight flickered between them, casting long shadows over the silent table. In her heart, something cracked. In the days that followed, Grace felt the gap between them widen into a canyon. Brandon's late arrivals turned into overnight absences. She'd wake in the early morning hours to an empty bed, his pillow untouched. When she asked where he had been, he offered vague replies: work, clients, stress. She stopped asking. The warmth he once showed toward her had vanished, replaced by a chilling indifference. He never mentioned the baby again. Grace, now nearly 8 weeks along, began attending appointments alone, holding the printed ultrasound images against her chest as she sat in parked cars, wondering where the man she married had gone. The silence grew unbearable. She would leave notes on the kitchen counter, little things like doctor's appointment today at 3 or picked up prenatal vitamins, but they were always ignored, untouched. One night, she left his dinner covered on the table and went to bed early, too exhausted to pretend anymore. From the bedroom, she heard him come in, rustle around, and retreat to the living room. She never heard the TV turn on. Only silence. Even when she cried quietly into her pillow, he didn't come. In that silence, Grace began to understand Brandon wasn't distant because he was overwhelmed. He was pulling away. On purpose. On a rainy Tuesday, Grace found Brandon in the kitchen, pouring himself coffee. She decided to speak, her voice steady despite the tight knot in her chest. "Can we talk?" she asked. Brandon didn't look up. "If it's about the baby again," she cut him off. "It's about us. What's happening to us?" He finally met her eyes, but there was no softness there. Only cold detachment. "We're not working, Grace," he said. "We haven't been for a while." The words hung heavy in the air. "I'm pregnant, Brandon," she whispered, as if he needed reminding. "We're having a child." He looked away, jaw tight. "I know. That's why I need space." The words crushed her. Space? When their lives were about to become more intertwined than ever? "So, what, are you leaving?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," he replied. "Not yet. I'll stay in the guest room. For now." That night, he gathered his things and moved into the small room down the hall. Grace sat in their bedroom, staring at the half-empty closet, her hands protectively over her stomach. She felt like she was disappearing, one piece at a time. The man she once trusted with her dreams now couldn't stand to share a bed with her. And worse, he acted like it was her fault. 2 weeks passed with barely a word exchanged. Brandon moved through the house like a guest, showering at odd hours and leaving before sunrise. Grace stopped trying to initiate conversations. The isolation became a second skin. One morning, as she sat at the kitchen table sipping her prenatal smoothie, Brandon entered in a crisp suit. He placed a sealed manila envelope on the table in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, heart already racing. "Read it," he said, not meeting her gaze. Then he walked out the door. Hands trembling, Grace opened the envelope. The words at the top read, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." She stared in disbelief. The walls closed in. The room spun. 7 months pregnant, and her husband wanted out. No discussion. No counseling. Just papers. She pressed her hands to her belly as if to shield the baby from the weight of betrayal. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she reread the documents, noting every signature, every clause. A fire began to kindle in her chest. This wasn't a mistake. It was calculated. He had planned this. And as her baby stirred within her for the first time, Grace whispered through gritted teeth, "Not like this." Something inside her shifted. She wasn't broken. Not yet. Grace sat in her car in front of the family law office, the divorce papers clutched in her lap, now covered in yellow sticky notes. She had read through them twice, not believing how methodically Brandon had tried to erase her from his life. There was no mention of the child, no provisions, no shared property disputes, just a cold, emotionless severance. That afternoon, she waited for him to return, hoping for even a trace of explanation. When he walked through the door, she stood in the hallway, her voice steady. "Why?" she asked. "Why now, when I'm carrying your child?" Brandon let out a hollow sigh and didn't even bother putting his keys down. "You were a mistake," he said without flinching, his tone devoid of regret. "This baby was never part of the plan. I don't want this life, Grace. I never did." The words knocked the air from her lungs. Her knees weakened, but she stood her ground. She stared into the face of the man she had once loved, and in his eyes, she saw nothing, no guilt, no hesitation. Just apathy. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came. He stepped around her and went upstairs, leaving her in the quiet wreckage of a moment she would never forget. The line between love and cruelty had just been crossed. The next morning, Grace tried to keep it together. She had an appointment for a prenatal checkup and forced herself to eat a piece of toast before heading out. As she stood at the bathroom sink brushing her teeth, a sharp pain tore through her lower abdomen. She dropped the toothbrush and doubled over, gripping the edge of the counter. Sweat formed instantly on her brow. She gasped for breath, heart pounding. The pain didn't ease. A wave of dizziness overtook her, and the next thing she remembered was waking up on the cold tile floor, her cheek pressed against it, one hand instinctively cradling her stomach. She was rushed to the hospital after a neighbor heard her fall and called an ambulance. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness as nurses wheeled her through the sterile corridors. She heard words like dehydrated, uterine stress, and monitor the baby. Her OB, Dr. Nguyen, appeared and gave her a tight-lipped smile. "You're okay. But your body's overwhelmed. You need rest, hydration, and above all, less stress." Brandon didn't come. No texts, no calls. Grace looked out the window of the hospital room at the overcast sky and wondered how she had ended up so utterly alone in what should have been the most beautiful chapter of her life. 2 days later, as the ultrasound technician gently moved the probe across Grace's abdomen, the familiar rhythmic sound of a heartbeat filled the room. The baby was strong, stubbornly kicking against the pressure of the probe. Grace smiled weakly, tears rolling down her cheeks. "She's a fighter," the tech said kindly. "Would you like a copy of the sonogram?" Grace nodded. As she left the room, an older nurse with silver hair and kind eyes stopped her in the hallway. "You're here alone?" the nurse asked softly. Grace managed a nod, her throat tight. "You shouldn't have to be," the nurse said. "I've seen too many women walk this hallway alone. It's not right." The nurse introduced herself as Martha and offered to walk Grace back to her room. Along the way, she asked questions, non-invasive ones, just enough to understand. Grace found herself opening up, slowly at first, and then like a dam breaking. Martha listened without interruption. "You remind me of someone I once knew," she said as they arrived at the room. She was brave, too, even when everything around her fell apart. As she turned to leave, Martha added, "Don't let this moment define your story. You're not at the end, sweetheart. You're standing at a beginning disguised as a breakdown." Later that evening, as the machines beside her beeped steadily and the lights of the hospital dimmed, Grace awoke to find Brandon sitting in the chair at the far end of the room. For a brief moment, she thought he had come to make things right. But the expression on his face told her otherwise. "I came to see if you signed the papers," he said bluntly. "I have a deadline to meet if we want this done by next month." Her jaw clenched. "You don't even ask how we're doing," she said, one hand instinctively resting on her stomach. He glanced at her belly and then looked away. "That's your thing, not mine." She sat up slowly, pushing against the stiffness in her muscles. "I won't sign," she said quietly. "Not until the baby is born. And not under your terms." Brandon scoffed, rising from the chair. "Do what you want. Just don't expect me to be here." With that, he walked out, and the door closed with a soft but final click. Grace stared at the blank wall in front of her, feeling her resolve sharpen. That visit was the last time she saw him at the hospital. Something inside her solidified that night, a quiet, fierce determination that she wouldn't let her child be born into silence and shame. After she was discharged, Grace returned home to a space that no longer felt like hers. Every room was filled with echoes, faint remnants of laughter, lazy Sundays, whispered dreams shared over coffee. She stepped into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. Out of habit, she opened the drawer on her nightstand, searching for her journal. That's when she saw it, a folded piece of paper tucked underneath an old jewelry box. She recognized Brandon's handwriting immediately. It was a letter, one he had written to her 5 years ago on their anniversary. She unfolded it slowly, her fingers trembling. In it, he had written about the way she made him feel alive, how her strength grounded him, how he couldn't wait to build a family with her. "You make everything feel possible," he had scrawled at the end. Grace read the letter 3 times, trying to reconcile the man in those words with the one who now avoided her like a stranger. The difference was jarring. She held the paper to her chest and let out a deep, guttural sob. That night, she made a decision. If Brandon had forgotten who she was, and who they were, then she would remind him. But not through tears or begging. Through truth, evidence, and a courtroom. The following week, Grace returned to the hospital for a final series of tests. After the appointment, she lingered near the exit, unsure of where to go next. Just as she reached for the door, Martha appeared, holding 2 coffees. "I had a feeling I'd find you here," the nurse said with a warm smile. They sat together on a bench outside, the cool breeze rustling the branches above. Grace confided in Martha everything: Brandon's abandonment, the divorce papers, the loneliness that curled around her like a fog. Martha listened intently, her expression steady, then shared her own story, one Grace didn't expect to hear. Years ago, Martha had also been left while pregnant. Her ex-husband had disappeared, claiming he wasn't built for fatherhood. At the time, she was a nursing student, barely able to afford groceries. But through persistence and the help of a kind professor, she not only graduated but became one of the most respected trauma nurses in the state. "I know what it feels like to be discarded when you need someone most," Martha said. "But I also know that there's more strength in you than you realize." She paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "Have you thought about fighting back? Not out of revenge, but for justice?" Grace blinked. "I wouldn't even know where to start." Martha smiled slowly. "I think I do." That evening, Martha connected Grace with a trusted friend, Derek, a discreet private investigator who had once helped Martha secure evidence in a malpractice case. Derek met Grace at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. He was soft-spoken, observant, and spoke with calm precision. "Tell me everything you suspect," he said, placing a notepad on the table. Grace hesitated at first, unsure if she was imagining things, but when she recalled how distant Brandon had become well before the pregnancy and how prepared he seemed with the divorce papers, Derek's brow furrowed. "It's not uncommon for someone to prepare their escape in silence," he noted. Over the next 2 weeks, Derek worked quietly in the background. Grace went about her days, pretending to live normally, even as the silence at home grew louder. Then, one night, Derek called. "I found something," he said. "You were right to trust your instincts." He emailed her photos, Brandon entering and exiting a luxury apartment building 3 towns over. On several nights, he was seen with the same woman. One photo, dated just 3 weeks after Grace told him about the pregnancy, showed them embracing in the parking garage. Grace stared at the screen in silence. The betrayal she'd felt before now burned with proof. She wasn't grieving a man. She was uncovering a fraud. Derek soon learned that the woman Brandon had been visiting was Kelly Donahue, his coworker. Grace remembered her, a polished, ambitious project lead Brandon often mentioned during dinner. He had described her as overly driven and too uptight, but Grace now realized that deflection had always been a form of misdirection. Derek's photos grew more detailed. Kelly and Brandon weren't just seeing each other, they had signed a lease on a shared apartment just 2 months before Grace received the divorce papers. Brandon was planning an entirely new life while pretending to be overwhelmed by work. One afternoon, Derek slipped a slim folder into Grace's hands. Inside were copies of lease agreements, time-stamped photos, and even a shared utilities bill with both their names. Grace's hands shook as she flipped through the pages. "They made their decision without even giving me the dignity of the truth," she muttered. Derek gave a small nod. "Most people assume a pregnant woman won't fight. They're wrong." That night, Grace sat at her desk and wrote down a list of everything Brandon had tried to take from her: peace, safety, dignity, and the future of their child. Then, underneath it, she wrote one word: accountability. As the final pieces of Derek's investigation came together, Grace met again with Martha in the hospital garden. The nurse listened carefully as Grace laid out everything she had learned. Martha leaned back, her eyes firm. "This isn't just betrayal. It's premeditated emotional abandonment during a vulnerable period. Courts don't take that lightly." Grace had never considered herself confrontational. She avoided conflict, forgave quickly, and often internalized blame. But pregnancy had changed something. She wasn't just fighting for herself now. She was defending the life of her child, who deserved truth, stability, and respect. Brandon had clearly expected a quiet exit, a woman too tired, too overwhelmed, and too broken to resist. But Grace was building strength in the most painful of ways. She contacted a legal aid office that partnered with single mothers and shared Derek's findings. The lawyer, a sharp but compassionate woman named Monica, sat silently as Grace explained everything. At the end, Monica tapped the folder Derek compiled. "This will destroy him in court," she said. "And it should." Grace took a deep breath, letting the words settle in her chest. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was preparing to strike back, methodically and legally, with the truth as her weapon. In preparation for the court filing, Monica requested all marital documents, including the prenuptial agreement. Grace blinked in confusion. "We never signed one," she said. But when Monica ordered a title search on Brandon's financial dealings, she discovered something strange. Hidden in a real estate transaction from 3 years ago was a clause referencing a private agreement, signed by Brandon alone, stating that Grace would waive any claim to shared assets in the event of a separation. Alarmed, Monica dug deeper. The document wasn't a valid prenup, but a manipulated contract Brandon had quietly prepared and signed without disclosure. "It's legally useless," Monica said, "but it tells me something about intent." Grace read over the document in disbelief. Brandon had tried to lock her out of every future asset, even though she helped him secure over the years. He never planned for them to be equals. He had always planned for escape. Grace remembered the countless nights she stayed up proofreading his work reports, the weekends she sacrificed so he could network at company events. Every step of the life they built, she had helped pave. Now he wanted to erase her with paper and ink. "He's going to learn," she whispered, "that some women don't stay silent." One morning, Monica called Grace in with a quiet urgency in her voice. "I've uncovered something else," she said, sliding a series of printouts across her desk. Grace studied them carefully, documents showing Brandon had recently transferred ownership of a vacation home and a rental property into a new trust. The trust had one curious detail: the beneficiary was Kelly Donahue. "He's shifting assets," Monica explained. trying to protect them from divorce proceedings. Grace sat back in disbelief. While she had been measuring prenatal vitamins and attending ultrasounds alone, Brandon had been erasing her from their shared financial history. Monica wasn't surprised. This kind of behavior is common when someone wants to rewrite the ending on their terms, she said. But what Brandon didn't realize was that paper trails always spoke louder than intentions. These transfers, made while still legally married, violated community property laws in their state. With this evidence, Monica prepared a motion to freeze Brandon's assets temporarily. He made the mistake of thinking he could outsmart everyone, she said. Grace nodded slowly, the weight of truth settling heavily over her. She wasn't chasing revenge, she was demanding recognition for what was stolen under the guise of silence. By the time the court date arrived, Grace had entered her third trimester. Her belly was round and prominent, a physical declaration of everything she had endured and carried. Monica advised her to appear strong, calm, and clear, exactly as she had been in every meeting. Grace wore a simple navy dress, hair pinned back, eyes steady. As she stepped into the courtroom, she spotted Brandon seated at the plaintiff's table, looking polished and unbothered. He was flanked by a high-priced attorney and wore the smug expression of someone convinced the outcome was already his. He didn't even acknowledge her. When she took her place, he whispered something to his lawyer and chuckled. Grace didn't blink. She had imagined this moment for weeks, the chance to confront not only his betrayal but his arrogance. The judge entered, and as everyone rose, Grace felt her baby kick sharply. It was as if her daughter sensed the importance of the moment. Let's begin, the judge said. Papers shuffled, voices calmed, and the proceedings started. Grace gripped her notes, steady and prepared. Brandon had wanted a quick end. What he got instead was the opening scene of his unraveling. In the days leading up to the hearing, Grace had meticulously rehearsed her statements. Monica had coached her not to let emotion override fact but encouraged her to speak from lived experience. Grace had written everything by hand, late at night, in the nursery that was still half-painted. She knew the timeline, the betrayals, the legal infractions. She also knew that Brandon's defense relied entirely on the illusion that she was emotionally unstable, unable to care for a child alone. It was ironic, she thought, considering she had already been doing it for months, with strength Brandon had never possessed. At the pre-hearing meeting, Monica placed her hand on Grace's and said, "No matter how confident he looks, remember, truth has a weight that ego can't carry." Grace nodded. That phrase stuck with her. She began to walk differently, speak differently, her words measured, her presence firm. When she passed Brandon in the hall before the hearing resumed, he looked at her stomach with a hint of annoyance, not wonder. Still dragging this out, he murmured under his breath. Grace turned, looked him in the eye, and replied, "No. I'm finishing what you started, with facts." His smile faltered. For the first time, he looked uncertain. As the first day of the hearing unfolded, Brandon's attorney presented a picture of a failed marriage, one where Brandon had been emotionally mistreated and pressured into fatherhood. Grace remained silent, taking notes, only speaking when prompted. But when Monica concluded their initial response, Grace gently raised her hand. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to represent myself for a few moments." The judge studied her. "You have legal counsel," he said. "Yes," Grace replied. "But I believe some truths carry more weight coming from the person who lived them." After a pause, the judge allowed it. Grace stood, notes in hand, and calmly outlined her timeline: the positive pregnancy test, Brandon's detachment, the envelope on the kitchen table, the hospital stay he ignored. She spoke of the ultrasound, of Kelly Donahue, of real estate transfers and forged agreements. Her voice didn't tremble. Even when she described how Brandon never once asked about their unborn child, she remained composed. When she finally sat down, the courtroom was quiet. Monica leaned over and whispered, "That wasn't a testimony. That was a reckoning." Even the judge scribbled faster than usual. Brandon, now staring at the table, didn't laugh again that afternoon. The next morning, Monica submitted Derek's full report into evidence. The courtroom projector displayed photo after photo of Brandon and Kelly, on dates, holding hands, entering and exiting shared spaces. A collective murmur rose as timestamps proved the relationship had begun while Grace was still in her first trimester. Brandon's attorney attempted to object, claiming irrelevance, but the judge raised his hand. "Infidelity while your client was requesting divorce from a pregnant wife is absolutely relevant," he said. Grace felt a slow, calm fire build inside her. Brandon avoided eye contact, his fingers tapping anxiously on the table. Then came the financial documents, trust transfers, forged agreements, the hidden assets. Monica's tone never rose, but her words cut sharp. "This is not just a marital dispute," she said. "This is a case of deception, abandonment, and attempted financial erasure. And it involves a vulnerable woman carrying his child." When Grace looked toward Brandon, she no longer saw a man who held power. She saw a coward who had relied on lies to feel invincible. And now, in a courtroom where truth had the final say, his empire of half-truths was beginning to collapse. Quietly. Completely. On the third day of the hearing, Monica requested permission to bring forward a forensic accountant who had examined Brandon's personal and business accounts. Grace sat calmly, hands folded, as statements were projected showing multiple withdrawals and asset transfers made shortly after the pregnancy was confirmed. The amounts were significant, funneled through shell accounts and temporary holding firms, all carefully timed to avoid suspicion. The judge leaned forward, visibly disturbed. Brandon's attorney shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. The truth was undeniable. "Mr. Walsh," the judge addressed Brandon, "were you preparing for divorce before your wife even knew it?" Brandon cleared his throat, struggling to form a reply. "I was considering options," he mumbled. Monica stood. "Your Honor, these financial moves, paired with his cohabitation with another woman, point to clear intent. Not just to divorce, but to strip my client of every right, quietly, illegally, and cruelly." Brandon's confidence eroded in front of everyone. For the first time, his polished appearance couldn't shield him from the consequences of his choices. Grace didn't smile. She didn't need to. The truth was doing all the talking. During a recess, Brandon cornered Grace in the hallway outside the courtroom, away from the prying eyes of the attorneys and audience. His tone was sharp, low, almost panicked. "You can't do this," he hissed. "You're destroying everything I've built." Grace met his glare without flinching. "No, Brandon. You destroyed it. I'm just giving it a proper name." His fists clenched, jaw tightening. "Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" She raised an eyebrow. "Like the man you are." The sting in her words left him silent for a moment. He leaned in closer. "If you think this will end well for you, you're wrong," he muttered. Grace took a small step forward, her voice quiet but firm. "This isn't about revenge, Brandon. It's about showing our daughter what dignity looks like when someone tries to bury it." Before he could respond, Monica appeared at the end of the hallway. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Perfectly," Grace replied. She turned away from her ex-husband, her steps slow and deliberate. Each one felt like a release from years of doubt. Brandon had underestimated the quiet power of someone who had nothing left to lose, but everything to protect. As court resumed after the recess, Brandon's side shifted tactics. His lawyer tried to argue that Grace had manipulated the timeline, that her emotional state during pregnancy clouded her recollection. She's hormonal, Your Honor, the attorney stated, and her memory may be influenced by stress. The room stilled. Monica rose calmly. Let the record show that my client has not only remained factual and composed but has brought verifiable documentation at every stage. Hormones don't forge documents, Your Honor. People like her husband do. The courtroom murmured in agreement, and even the judge's mouth twitched in visible irritation. Then, unexpectedly, Kelly Donahue was called as a witness. She entered in a designer blouse, her expression icy. Under oath, she stumbled through answers, denying involvement at first, until Monica presented emails between her and Brandon discussing Grace's pregnancy as a setback and referencing Brandon's clean break plan. Kelly paled. I didn't know she was still in the picture, she muttered. He said it was over. Her credibility collapsed. Grace watched in silence, not out of satisfaction, but out of clarity. Every lie was crumbling. And with it, the illusion that Brandon had so carefully built. Just as the judge began to prepare for closing remarks, Monica requested one final witness. The courtroom door opened, and in walked Marianne Holtz, Grace's former supervisor at the public library. Grace's breath caught. She hadn't expected this. Marianne took the stand and spoke of Grace's years of dedicated work, her calm leadership, her resilience in stressful environments. When budget cuts came, she stayed late to write grant proposals. When our roof leaked, she fundraised to fix it. This is not a woman who breaks under pressure. This is a woman who holds others together. Monica approached. Were you aware that Mr. Walsh claimed she was mentally unfit to raise a child due to stress? Marianne's eyes narrowed. I've seen Grace mentor teenagers, help elderly patrons, and organize entire community events. If she's unfit, the world's in trouble. The judge nodded slowly. Brandon sank lower in his chair. The courtroom wasn't just hearing facts, it was seeing Grace in full light. Not a victim. A builder. A protector. A force. It was no longer about what Brandon had done. It was about who Grace had always been, even when no one noticed. As the final day of the hearing drew to a close, the judge adjusted his glasses and spoke in a tone that carried both weight and clarity. This case has revealed not only betrayal but calculated efforts to remove a woman from her rights during one of the most vulnerable times of her life. His words echoed across the chamber. What concerns me most is not the divorce itself, but the orchestration behind it, the emotional abandonment, the financial deceit, the manipulation of documents designed to erase a partner quietly. He turned toward Brandon. You did not merely file for divorce. You attempted to rewrite reality while she carried your child. Then, to Grace, he added, Mrs. Walsh, your composure and evidence were nothing short of exemplary. I commend you. Brandon's face was pale. No more smirks. No more whispers to his lawyer. Only silence. Grace nodded once, her eyes glassy but strong. The gavel had not yet fallen, but the verdict was already clear. The man who believed he could shame her in silence now stood publicly undone. And she, who had once wept alone on a hospital floor, now stood in full light, with truth at her side. After the session adjourned for the day, the courtroom slowly emptied, leaving only a few people gathering documents and packing briefcases. Grace stood quietly near the front, her hands resting over her stomach, her mind still echoing with the judge's words. As she turned to leave, Brandon approached her with hesitant steps. His confident posture had vanished, replaced with a slouched, uncertain frame. "Grace," he began, voice low, almost pleading. She paused but didn't speak. He looked down at the floor before continuing, "I didn't think it would go this far. I never thought you'd fight like this." She raised her eyes to meet his, unmoved. "You didn't think I'd stand up for myself," she replied. His lips parted, as if to respond, but instead he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "It's a letter," he said. "For the baby. In case you won't let me see her." Grace stared at the paper in his hand. "It's not me who kept you away," she said firmly. "You made that choice long before she ever arrived." His face twisted in regret. "Please," he whispered, "forgive me." Grace shook her head slowly. "Forgiveness isn't given when it's convenient. It's earned. And you haven't even started." The courtroom was quiet as the judge prepared to deliver the final verdict. Grace sat beside Monica, her heart steady, her breathing slow. The months of anxiety, betrayal, and relentless preparation had led to this moment. Brandon sat further down the bench, his face drained of expression. Based on the testimony and evidence provided, the judge began, "This court finds the defendant's actions to be intentionally deceptive, financially manipulative, and emotionally abusive under conditions that directly endangered the well-being of the plaintiff and her unborn child." Monica gave Grace's hand a slight squeeze. Grace didn't move, only listened. "I hereby award sole custody to Mrs. Walsh," the judge continued. "In addition, Mr. Walsh will pay monthly child support, retroactively applied to the date of abandonment. The transfer of assets shall be reversed under court supervision, and damages awarded to the plaintiff for emotional and financial distress." A gasp rose faintly from the crowd. Grace remained composed, her heart quietly pounding with relief. Brandon lowered his head, unable to look at anyone. When the gavel fell, it wasn't a loud sound, it was soft, almost subtle. But it was final. Grace had won, not just the case, but the right to reclaim her life. 2 weeks after the ruling, under the soft glow of early morning light, Grace went into labor. She had planned for this moment with the same resolve that carried her through court, bags packed, birth plan written, her hospital room carefully chosen for peace and quiet. Martha was there the entire time, holding her hand, whispering calm encouragements as the contractions came and went. The pain was intense, but Grace bore it with a kind of quiet endurance that surprised even her. She was not afraid. She had walked through far darker pain already, and this was life beginning. Hours later, the room filled with the sound of a newborn's cry. Grace exhaled, tears streaming down her face as the nurse placed a small, warm bundle against her chest. The baby's eyes were closed, her fists curled tight. She was perfect. Grace gently stroked her cheek and whispered, "You made it." Martha smiled beside her, brushing Grace's hair from her forehead. "What will you name her?" she asked. Grace looked down at her daughter, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "Hope," she said. "Because that's what kept me going. Even when everything else tried to break me." Life after the courtroom and hospital unfolded slowly, gently, with quiet routines and early mornings. Grace settled into her new apartment, a modest space with soft light and calm walls, a nursery decorated in pale greens and yellows. Hope slept soundly in her crib nearby, and each night, Grace would watch her chest rise and fall, a soft rhythm that filled the silence with purpose. She no longer checked the door or waited for footsteps that would never come. Instead, she welcomed the quiet. It was not loneliness. It was peace. In time, Grace began to write. At first, it was just scattered thoughts, moments she wanted to hold on to. But the words grew, pages filling with pieces of her journey, her heartbreak, her courage, the quiet strength that grew under pressure. A friend suggested she submit a piece to a local journal. The editor replied within days, "This needs to be shared." From that moment, Grace found a new purpose, not only as a mother, but as a voice. One that spoke for the women who had been abandoned, silenced, and erased. Her story, once buried under shame, now echoed with dignity. A year later, on the anniversary of her court victory, Grace stood in front of a small crowd at a community women's center, holding hope on her hip. Her book had just been released. Titled Grace, fully, it had become more than a memoir, it was a declaration. She read an excerpt aloud, her voice unwavering. At the end, the room stood in applause, and several women came forward with tears in their eyes. "You gave me courage," one whispered. Grace smiled gently. "No. You always had it. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us." As the event wrapped up, Martha arrived late, holding a bouquet of sunflowers. "You did it," she said with a proud smile. Grace hugged her tightly. Hope babbled between them, grabbing at the petals. In that moment, everything came together, the pain, the healing, the strength forged in silence. Grace kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "You are the reason I never gave up." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the center, Grace stood tall, not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as a woman who had rewritten her own ending with truth, fire, and grace.